You want to hear about pain? About how the universe can take a knife and twist it so deep in your chest that you forget how to breathe. Then sit down and listen, because what I'm about to tell you will tear open wounds you didn't even know you had. It started with a bracelet. A simple piece of gold that shouldn't have existed anymore. Shouldn't have been sitting on a 12-year-old boy's wrist when he walked into my house that Tuesday afternoon like it was just another day. Like my world wasn't about to collapse into 30 years of lies. The sunlight was filtering through my lace curtains, the ones I'd hung when my son was still alive, or when I thought he was still alive. I was humming some old hymn while setting the table for lunch, just a simple meal for my grandson and his new friend. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls and lavender polish, everything normal and peaceful. Everything a lie. Then came the knock on the door. Such an innocent sound. 3 gentle raps that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. My grandson called out, "Grandma, this is my friend." The boy stepped forward, shy but polite, the way good children are raised. I smiled and reached out to shake his hand, to welcome him into my home the way I'd welcomed countless children over the years. But then I saw it. A flash of gold around his thin wrist. My hand started trembling before our palms even touched. Time slowed to a crawl, and I felt like I was drowning in my own living room. That bracelet, God Almighty, that bracelet was the same one I'd given my son the day he left home 30 years ago. I'd know it anywhere. I'd trace those engravings with my fingertips 1,000 times before he stormed out of this house. I remember that day like it was burned into my retinas. My teenage boy, angry and hurt, ready to take on the world. I'd fastened that bracelet around his wrist myself, my hands shaking because I knew something terrible was about to happen. He looked me in the eyes and promised, "I'll never take it off, Mama. No matter what happens, I'll never take it off." And then he was gone. Gone into the rain and the darkness, and all I had left were police sirens and a closed coffin that never held his body. But here it was again. On this child's wrist. Gleaming like it had just been polished, like it had been waiting 30 years to come home. The boy was still smiling, completely unaware that he'd just shattered my world. His innocent voice cut through the roaring in my ears. "Where did you get that bracelet?" My voice came out as a whisper, barely human. The words felt like broken glass in my throat. He answered so simply, so matter-of-factly, "It was my dad's. Mom said he got it before he died." Died. The word echoed in my skull like a gunshot. My grip on reality started to slip, and somewhere behind me, the kettle began to scream. How fitting. Everything was screaming. 30 years. 30 goddamn years I'd begged God for a sign. 30 years of unanswered prayers, of crying myself to sleep, of staring at empty photo albums and wondering what I'd done wrong as a mother. 30 years of guilt eating me alive from the inside out, wondering if I could have said something different, done something different, been someone different that would have kept my boy home. And now that sign was standing in front of me, wearing my son's bracelet, calling some other woman mother. I excused myself to the kitchen, my legs barely carrying me. I gripped the counter so hard my knuckles went white, staring at the backsplash tiles I'd picked out when life still made sense. The bracelet kept gleaming in my peripheral vision, taunting me, mocking 30 years of mourning. Let me tell you about isolation. Let me tell you about betrayal so deep it changes the molecular structure of your bones. Let me tell you about the special kind of hell reserved for mothers who lose their children to family secrets. Years earlier, when my son was just 18, he'd had a fight with his father. Not just any fight, the kind that splits families apart like fault lines in an earthquake. My husband, God rest his hypocritical soul, couldn't stand that our boy had gotten a girl pregnant. Couldn't stand the shame of it, the gossip, the way it would look at church. So my son left. Stormed out into the night with nothing but the clothes on his back and that bracelet around his wrist. Days turned to weeks. I called everyone I could think of, drove to every place he might have gone. My husband told me to let him go, said he'd come back when he learned his lesson. He never came back. Then the news came like a sledgehammer to the chest. His car found by the riverbank, empty and cold. The authorities searched for days, but never found a body. The case went cold. My husband told me to move on, to stop living in the past, to accept that our son was gone. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I kept his room exactly the way he'd left it, clothes still in the hamper, homework still spread across his desk. I'd sit in there for hours, holding his pillow, breathing in the fading scent of his cologne and teenage dreams. The bracelet haunted my dreams, that last image of it catching the porch light as he walked away from me forever. Now it was back. And I couldn't sleep. That night, I sat by my window, clutching my rosary, whispering my son's name over and over like a prayer, like an incantation that might bring him back from wherever he'd gone. The image of that bracelet wouldn't leave my mind. It burned behind my eyelids every time I closed them. I dragged out the old photo albums, the ones I'd hidden away because they hurt too much to look at. Page after page of my beautiful boy growing up, and there it was, that bracelet in a faded photograph, exactly the same. The engraving was identical, every scratch and mark exactly where I remembered them. The boy's story said his father died. But my heart, my mother's heart that had been screaming for 30 years, told me something different. My son was alive. Or someone had made damn sure I believed he wasn't. The next few days passed in a haze of suspicion and growing horror. I watched that boy when he came over, studied him like a detective studies evidence. Little things started jumping out at me, the way he tilted his head when he laughed, exactly like my son used to. The way he drummed his fingers on the table when he was thinking. The way he said yes ma'am with that same slight accent. I found a piece of paper he'd dropped, an old photograph torn in half. On the torn edge, barely visible, was my son's face. Younger, smiling, alive. My legs gave out, and I had to sit down right there on the living room floor, holding that scrap of photo like it was the last piece of my sanity. That's when I started investigating. Really investigating, not just grieving and wondering. I drove to the town where my son was last seen, the place where his car had been found. I talked to old neighbors, anyone who might remember something from 30 years ago. One elderly woman remembered a young girl who'd been pregnant and searching desperately for a man who'd vanished. A girl who'd cried on her doorstep, begging for any information about where he might have gone. That girl must have been the boy's mother. I found the old police officer who'd handled my son's case. He was retired now, living in a trailer park with too many cats and too many regrets. When I mentioned my son's name, his face went pale. "Ma'am," he said, "that case was sealed. Your husband demanded privacy. Said the family needed to grieve in peace. My husband hadn't protected our son's memory. He'd buried it. Buried the truth so deep that even I couldn't find it." The rage that filled me then was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was pure and clean and terrible, like staring into the face of God and realizing he'd been laughing at you all along. 30 years of grief, 30 years of guilt, 30 years of wondering what I'd done wrong as a mother, and it had all been built on lies. I invited them for dinner again. My grandson, the boy, and this time, I insisted the boy's mother come too. She was hesitant, nervous, like she sensed something was wrong. But she came. The tension at that dinner table was thick enough to cut with a knife. We made small talk about school and weather while I studied this woman who'd raised my grandson. She was tired-looking, worn down by years of single motherhood and secrets. But she loved that boy. I could see it in every protective glance, every gentle correction. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I set down my fork and looked her straight in the eyes. "Your son's father," I said, my voice steady as stone. "What was his name?" She hesitated, her face going pale. Her hands started shaking. She looked at her son, then back at me, and whispered my son's full name. His real name. The name I'd given him when he was born, the name I'd called out in empty rooms for 30 years. The silence that followed was deafening. My grandson dropped his fork, and it clattered against his plate like broken dreams. The boy looked confused, sensing the adults around him were drowning in something he couldn't understand. 30 years of grief turned to fire in my chest, I said, and my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else entirely. My son hadn't died. He was hidden from me. The woman started crying then, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Through her tears, she told me the truth that had been eating her alive for 3 decades. She'd loved him. Really, truly loved him with the kind of desperate teenage love that moves mountains and stops time. When he left his family, he'd promised to come back for her, to make things right so they could be together and raise their child. But he never returned. A man had come to see her, my husband, though she didn't know who he was at the time. He'd told her my son was dead, killed in a car accident far from home. He'd given her some of my son's belongings, including that bracelet, and told her it was all that was left of the father of her child. My husband. My lying, manipulative, controlling husband who couldn't stand the thought of our family being touched by scandal. He'd faked our son's death to keep him from disgracing the family name. He'd let me suffer for 30 years, let me blame myself, let me tear myself apart with guilt and grief, all to protect his precious reputation. The bracelet had been passed to the boy by his mother, who thought it was a keepsake from a dead man. She'd never known that somewhere a grandmother was crying herself to sleep every night, wondering what had happened to her baby. All those years I'd prayed for my son's soul, lighting candles and saying masses for his eternal rest. When I should have been praying for the truth. When I should have been fighting harder, looking deeper, refusing to accept the lies I was fed. That night, I went through my husband's old papers with the fury of a woman possessed. Hidden in the back of his filing cabinet, I found them. Forged documents, sealed letters, evidence of a cover-up that had stolen 30 years of my life. Evidence that my son might still be out there somewhere, not knowing that his mother had never stopped loving him, never stopped looking for him. I burned every single lie, fed them to the fireplace one by one, and watched 30 years of deception turn to ash. The flames felt like justice, like finally being able to breathe again after drowning for 3 decades. But the truth, when it finally comes, leaves scars that never fully heal. I acknowledged the boy as my grandson publicly, stood up in church, and told the whole congregation that blood had found blood, that God had brought my family back together despite the lies that tried to keep us apart. Some people were scandalized. Some whispered behind their hands. I didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them judge. They hadn't lived through 30 years of manufactured grief. The boy's mother and I started the slow, painful process of healing. We shared stories about my son, about the man he'd been, and the father he should have been. She told me about her pregnancy, about how she'd named their son after him, about how she'd kept his memory alive even though she thought he was dead. I told her about the room I'd kept exactly as he'd left it, about the dreams where he came home, about the way I'd blamed myself for letting him go. We cried together, 2 women who'd loved the same man in different ways, 2 women who'd been robbed of 30 years by one man's pride and shame. But my son was still gone. Finding his child didn't bring him back. The truth didn't resurrect the dead or heal the wounds that had festered for 3 decades. It just changed the shape of the pain, made it cleaner somehow, but no less deep. The final scene of this tragedy happened in my son's old room. I placed that bracelet in a wooden box beside his high school graduation photo, the one where he's smiling like the world is full of possibilities. The boy, my grandson, stood beside me, solemn and quiet, finally understanding the weight of what he'd been carrying on his wrist. Your father would have been proud of you, I whispered, and for the first time in 30 years, I believed it might be true. You want to know what I learned from all this? What wisdom I can offer from the ashes of my destroyed life. Blood calls to blood across time and distance and lies. Love doesn't die just because someone tells you it should. And the truth, no matter how buried, no matter how old, will always find a way to surface. 30 years ago, I lost a son to pride and fear and the kind of family secrets that poison everything they touch. Today, I found a grandson and discovered that love, real love, mother love, the kind that splits your chest open and rebuilds your heart, can survive anything, even the lies that tried to bury it. But don't mistake this for a happy ending. There are no happy endings when 30 years of your life have been built on deception. There's just truth, raw and bleeding and necessary. There's just the choice to keep loving despite the pain, to keep believing despite the betrayal, to keep fighting despite the exhaustion that comes from carrying grief for 3 decades. The bracelet sits in that wooden box now, next to photos and memories and all the words I never got to say. Sometimes I take it out and hold it, feeling the weight of all those lost years, all those missed birthdays and graduations and first days of school. Sometimes I imagine my son walking through that door, older now, weathered by whatever life he found after he left us. But he doesn't come. The dead stay dead, and the missing stay missing, and all we have left are the children they leave behind and the love that refuses to die even when everything else has been burned to the ground. That's the real truth about family, about love, about the secrets we think protect us, but really just destroy us from the inside out. The truth is that some wounds never heal, some losses never stop hurting, and some lies are so big they reshape the architecture of your entire life. But we keep going anyway. We keep loving anyway. We keep believing that somewhere, somehow, the people we've lost know that we never stopped looking for them, never stopped hoping they'd come home. Because that's what mothers do. That's what love does. It endures. It survives. It finds a way, even when everything else falls apart. And sometimes, just sometimes, it comes home wearing a gold bracelet and calling you grandma.